Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to Mr. Night Whisperer TT. Tonight, we bring you a true story, one that will creep into your thoughts long after you've closed your eyes. A case not from decades past, but from the digital age, where fiction and reality collided in the most terrifying way. This is the story of two 12-year-old girls who carried out an attack in the name of a creature that never existed, a faceless figure known only as Slender Man. The victim was their friend, Peyton Leutner, who survived 19 stab wounds in a Wisconsin forest. As for the attackers, they would never walk the same path again. Their sentences were not death or prison, but something more complicated. Decades locked in mental institutions as children whose minds blurred the boundary between fantasy and murder. Waukesha, Wisconsin, in 2014, was not the sort of place you'd expect headlines about attempted murder. It was suburban calm, split-level houses, driveways with basketball hoops, church gatherings on Sunday mornings, and kids pedaling their bikes through tree-lined streets. A place where neighbors waved to one another, where the most serious problems were usually about high school football scores or the occasional snowstorm that left driveways buried. I remember thinking, how could something so chilling grow in soil so ordinary? In neighborhoods like this, children carved their identities in quiet ways. They weren't wandering city streets or hustling through subways. They were logging onto computers. The internet was the great frontier of their childhood, offering stories, games, and, for some, entire new worlds. It's here that two girls, Morgan Geyser and Anissa Weier, found a story that would consume them. A tall, faceless man in a black suit, born not from folklore but from a Photoshop contest, spreading from forum to forum until kids whispered his name like he was real. But we'll get to him later. For now, picture this. 3 friends. Morgan, Anissa, and Peyton, though her friends called her Bella. They were ordinary 12-year-olds, laughing at inside jokes, staying up late for sleepovers, trading whispers about classmates and silly crushes. Bella was bright-eyed, open-hearted, the kind of friend who said yes to birthday invitations without hesitation. Morgan, on the other hand, lived in a world of imagination, sometimes too deep, too consuming. And Anissa, new to the group, often felt like she needed to prove herself, to belong. It began innocently, like so many stories do, a shared interest in spooky tales. Late night scrolling through websites where shadows were given shape by words. One girl telling another, "Did you hear about Slender Man?" The other leaning closer, curiosity catching like fire. By the time Bella joined them for Morgan's 12th birthday sleepover in May 2014, the fantasy wasn't just a story anymore. For Morgan and Anissa, it was a mission. Looking back at the days before the attack, neighbors and teachers noticed little that suggested danger. Morgan's mother remembered her daughter's fascination with fantasy, but thought it harmless, like any child with a vivid imagination. Anissa's parents admitted she struggled to make close friends, but nothing in their daughter's behavior screamed warning. Bella's parents, of course, could not have imagined that saying yes to a birthday party invitation would nearly cost their daughter her life. What unsettles me most is how ordinary it all looked. That weekend started like countless others. A birthday party, roller skating, pizza, a night of laughter. But in the background, Morgan and Anissa had been whispering for months, weaving a plan that was both absurd and horrifying. They believed Slender Man demanded a sacrifice. They believed that stabbing their friend would not only prove their loyalty, but also protect their families from harm. This is where I pause and think. Childhood is supposed to be a cocoon, fragile but safe. And yet, these girls were preparing to break it open with a knife. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the silence of Waukesha's streets that night, a silence thick with the kind of innocence adults take for granted. Behind closed doors, parents thought their children were safe, asleep in sleeping bags on a basement floor. In reality, two of them lay awake, planning where and when they would kill their friend. As dawn approached on May 31st, the day began with nothing unusual. The sun rose over quiet lawns, birds scattered from backyard fences. Inside Morgan's house, three girls ate breakfast together. But just beneath the surface of this ordinary morning, something monstrous stirred. Not supernatural, not Slender Man himself, but the dangerous power of belief. And this is where our story begins, with three girls and a shadow that wasn't real, in a town that thought it was safe. By the end of that day, one of them would be crawling through the woods with 19 stab wounds, another would be clutching a knife, and the last would be following along, certain they were on their way to meet a faceless man in a mansion hidden deep in the forest. The shadows had already settled. The strange thing about horror is that it doesn't always come from old folklore. Sometimes it's born in the most unlikely places. For Slender Man, the birthplace wasn't a dark forest or a crumbling castle. It was the internet, specifically a Photoshop contest in 2009. A few manipulated images showing a faceless figure lurking near children, uploaded to an online forum called Something Awful. That was all it took. The legend spread like fire on dry grass, passed from one message board to another, until it felt like he had always been there, stitched into the shadows of modern mythology. He was simple in design, but unforgettable. A tall man in a black suit, featureless face, limbs stretched just a little too long, haunting playgrounds and wooded paths. He didn't need an origin story. He thrived on vagueness. The less defined he was, the more room there was for people to imagine him. Children whispered about him at sleepovers, daring each other to look for him in photographs. YouTube creators spun entire series around him, most famously Marble Hornets, which turned him from a joke into something closer to folklore. By the early 2010s, Slender Man wasn't just a meme. He was a monster kids swore was real. And that's the terrifying part. For adults, he was an obvious invention. For 12-year-olds, navigating the blurred edges of the digital world, he was something else. In the same way children once whispered about Bloody Mary in bathroom mirrors, now they scrolled through creepypasta wikis, convincing themselves that a tall, faceless man could step through the screen. Morgan Geyser was one of those kids. Her fascination with the unreal was already intense. She lived in worlds of imagination, cartoon characters, and invented stories that blended into her daily life. For her, Slender Man wasn't just entertainment. He was protection. He was a figure that explained fear and danger, and at the same time, demanded loyalty. Anissa Weier came to him differently. She was lonely, hungry for belonging, and she found a friend who whispered that there was something bigger out there, something terrifying but powerful. Morgan told her about Slender Man, and Anissa leaned in. Where one child's imagination had created a private myth, now two children shared a secret faith. The creepypasta forums, the YouTube videos, the endless retellings online, they worked like scripture for them. They read about Slender Man's supposed mansion, hidden deep in the woods of northern Wisconsin. They whispered about how he demanded servants, called proxies, who would carry out his bidding. For Morgan and Anissa, those words weren't play acting. They were instructions. The unsettling truth about childhood is that belief is elastic. Children can slip between fantasy and reality with frightening ease. Most outgrow it, but for some, the fabric doesn't tear cleanly. Psychologists later explained that Morgan already showed early signs of schizophrenia, and Slender Man became the shape her delusions clung to. For Anissa, it was social pressure. Wanting to hold on to Morgan's friendship, she chose to believe what Morgan insisted was true. Meanwhile, Bella, Peyton Leutner, didn't share this obsession. She humored her friends, sure, but she didn't believe. And that difference, that refusal to treat Slender Man as real, made her an outsider in their growing world of fantasy. What began as whispers of a myth was slowly turning into a test of loyalty. Looking back, it's chilling to think how the internet, a space meant for stories and entertainment, became scripture in the minds of two 12-year-olds. They weren't the only kids reading about Slender Man, but most could separate the story from reality. Morgan and Anissa couldn't. There's a peculiar moment in every legend where it slips from fiction into belief. For these girls, that moment had already passed. They weren't reading stories anymore. They were planning to live them. Slender Man, faceless and silent, was no longer a myth to them. He was waiting, and in their minds, he wanted a sacrifice. Overusing the idea of blurring fantasy and reality, I'll explore obsession differently through interpersonal dynamics. Now, part 3 will show how Morgan and Anissa's friendship deepened through their shared belief, how Peyton became the outsider, and how obsession began to isolate them from normal childhood life. Part 3. Friendships at 12 are fragile things. They can hinge on something as small as liking the same books or sitting together at lunch. But they can also fracture, slowly, when two friends begin to drift into a world the third can't follow. That's what happened between Morgan, Anissa, and Bella. Morgan and Anissa weren't just friends, they fed off one another. Morgan, with her vivid imagination and commanding personality, had ideas that could consume an afternoon. Anissa, searching for belonging, let herself be swept into those ideas. It was intoxicating. They began to talk about Slender Man as if he were watching them, listening to their conversations. What started as spooky fun hardened into ritual. Bella, though, didn't play along. She laughed it off. She liked scary stories, sure, but she didn't pretend they were real, and that subtle resistance changed everything. For Morgan and Anissa, Bella's disbelief became a threat. If she didn't believe, then maybe she wasn't safe to keep around. Or worse, maybe she would expose them. The obsession grew in private places. The back of a classroom, whispered conversations during recess, long stretches of time on the school bus where Morgan and Anissa leaned close, plotting. Teachers later said they hadn't noticed anything unusual. But classmates remembered their intensity, the way the two seemed to live in a bubble of their own. They weren't joking anymore. They were making plans. Morgan filled notebooks with sketches and thoughts about Slender Man. She drew him over and over, a faceless silhouette on the page. At home, she spent hours online combing through creepypasta wikis, reading about proxies, sacrifices, and the supposed mansion in the Nicolet National Forest. She believed it was real, not just a story written by strangers. Anissa provided reinforcement. She wasn't delusional in the same way, but she wanted Morgan's approval. When Morgan said Slender Man required proof of loyalty, Anissa nodded. When Morgan whispered that Bella could be the proof, Anissa didn't push back. Friendship, for her, meant loyalty, and she gave it, even when it meant entertaining something unthinkable. What's haunting about this stage of the story is how ordinary it all looked from the outside. Parents saw little more than girls hanging out, chatting about internet stories. Nobody realized that in those hours spent together, obsession was rewriting the rules of their friendship. Bella didn't sense it either. She trusted them. She thought she was among friends. Psychologists later debated whether this was simply delusion meeting vulnerability, or whether something darker in adolescent dynamics was at play. Could two children, barely out of elementary school, really conspire with intent? Or were they swept into something they couldn't fully grasp? The courts would wrestle with that question. But at this moment, in spring 2014, Morgan and Anissa weren't considering philosophy. They were considering weapons. By May, the obsession had turned into concrete planning. They talked about how they would do it, where, when, and what would happen afterward. Their conversations weren't frantic. They were calm, methodical. They believed that if they killed Bella, they could earn Slenderman's favor and go live with him in the forest. Imagine that. 12 years old, making murder sound like a camping trip. Bella, meanwhile, was preparing for a birthday sleepover. She picked out her pajamas, wrapped a small gift, and looked forward to celebrating with her friends. She couldn't have known that, for Morgan and Anissa, the party wasn't about cake and roller skating anymore. It was about the moment that they would try to make myth into reality. Friendship had turned into obsession, and obsession was about to turn into violence. Birthday parties at 12 should be simple things. Streamers taped to the walls, paper plates stacked beside pizza boxes, the sweet smell of frosting wafting from a cake with too many candles. Morgan's 12th birthday began like that, the kind of evening parents would later replay in their minds, desperate to spot a sign they had missed. But there were none. On the surface, it was just 3 friends laughing in the glow of a suburban living room. They had gone roller skating that afternoon, music echoing through the rink, wheels clattering on polished floors. Bella giggled as she stumbled, Morgan catching her by the wrist, Anissa hovering close behind. For Bella, it was just fun. For Morgan and Anissa, it was camouflage, normalcy draped over something waiting to hatch. Later, at Morgan's house, the girls crowded into the kitchen where her mother lit the candles. 12 flames flickered, reflections glimmering in Morgan's eyes. Bella clapped, cheering her friend on. Anissa smiled too, though her gaze darted from cake to Morgan, as if waiting for a cue. When Morgan made a wish and blew out the candles, no one knew the wish had already been spoken in her heart. Slender Man will be proud. The evening slipped into a comfortable rhythm. Pizza crusts left on plates, the glow of a DVD playing in the background, giggles rising from whispered jokes only 12-year-olds could find hilarious. They stayed up late, curling under blankets, talking about classmates, YouTube videos, and things too silly to repeat. Bella felt safe. Morgan and Anissa were planning. At one point, Morgan's mother came downstairs to check on them. She saw 3 girls lying side by side in sleeping bags, eyelids heavy, laughter trailing into yawns. Nothing unusual. She said good night and went back upstairs, reassured that her daughter was happy with her friends. She could not have known that under those blankets, 2 of the girls were quietly calculating how they might kill the third. The first plan, we later learned, was to attack Bella in her sleep. Morgan whispered it to Anissa, urging her to join in. They would wait until Bella was unconscious, then stab her before she woke. But nerves got in the way. Anissa said she couldn't do it, not while Bella's trusting face lay so close, so unguarded. The plan was delayed, folded into the next day. It's a detail that lingers in my mind. The image of Bella sleeping peacefully while her friends lay awake, deciding her fate. Childhood slumber parties are supposed to be filled with secrets about crushes or scary stories told with flashlights, not murder. Morning came gently, sunlight spilling through the blinds. The smell of breakfast filled the air. Bella stretched and rubbed her eyes, smiling at the thought of another day with her friends. She didn't know she had narrowly escaped death in the night. She didn't know that the plan had only been postponed. Morgan and Anissa exchanged glances as they ate. The weight of the knife they had hidden pressed on their minds. Bella, still cheerful, finished her breakfast, completely unaware of the silent pact forming beside her. By the time they left the house and headed toward the park, the air was warm, the day stretching wide open before them. Bella thought it was another day of play. Morgan and Anissa thought it was the day Slender Man would be satisfied. The party had ended. The real plan was about to begin. The morning carried no warning. To Bella, it was a continuation of the party, a new day to stretch their legs and wander the neighborhood before heading back home. The air was soft with early summer warmth, the kind of day that made children restless, pulling them outdoors to run through grass and climb playground structures. Morgan suggested they go to the park. Anissa agreed quickly. Bella followed, unsuspecting, her trust as easy as her footsteps. They walked along the streets, backpacks slung over their shoulders, their chatter skipping from topic to topic. Bella laughed at some silly joke, while Morgan's gaze kept flicking toward Anissa, silent questions exchanged in looks rather than words. David's park wasn't far. It was a patch of woods bordered by houses, a place where children often played hide and seek, where parents felt safe enough to let them roam for an hour. To Bella, it was familiar ground. To Morgan and Anissa, it was the chosen stage. They believed the trees would shelter them, conceal what they planned to do. The walk itself must have felt surreal. Imagine being Bella, trailing alongside your best friend and another girl, both smiling, both chatting about nothing, not realizing that with every step you were walking closer to an ambush. The cruelest thing about betrayal is that it often wears the face of companionship until the very last moment. At the playground, the girls played briefly, climbing structures and pretending to be ordinary children again. But Morgan grew restless. Her eyes darted toward the line of trees, the shaded path beyond. She wanted to get Bella away from open space. They coaxed her, suggesting hide and seek. Bella, eager and unsuspecting, agreed. The game led them further from the playground, toward the trees. Leaves rustled underfoot, the canopy thickening overhead. Sunlight filtered in slanted beams, dappling the ground like fragments of stained glass. For Bella, it was play. For the others, it was preparation. Morgan carried the knife in her backpack, its presence a heavy reminder with every movement. Anissa kept looking back, her face betraying hesitation. Later, she would tell police that she had second thoughts, that she urged Morgan to wait. But in the moment, she followed, each step taking them deeper into the woods. The silence there was different from the open park. It pressed closer, broken only by the scuff of sneakers and the sharp cries of birds overhead. Bella crouched to tie her shoe, and for a heartbeat, everything was normal again. Then Morgan's hand brushed the backpack zipper. She was ready, but not yet. Anissa whispered to her, urging patience, suggesting they move further still. They walked until they reached a more secluded spot, a place where the trees thickened and the sounds of the playground faded into distance. Bella looked around, puzzled but still unafraid. These were her friends. She had no reason to fear them. The woods were ordinary in every sense. No fog, no ominous glow, no supernatural presence. Just dirt trails and tangled roots, mosquitoes buzzing near stagnant puddles. And that is what makes it so haunting. Nothing about the place suggested danger. It was the company, not the setting, that carried the shadow. Looking back, investigators would later note the tragic simplicity of the moment. There was no grand ritual, no chant, no supernatural sign. Just 3 children in the woods, and 2 of them carrying a belief too sharp to ignore. When they stopped walking, the air felt heavy. Bella glanced between her friends, perhaps sensing something shift. Maybe she noticed the way Morgan's hand hovered near her backpack. Maybe she saw Anissa's nervous glance. But she didn't have time to piece it together. That was the threshold. The line between innocence and horror. They had reached the woods. And now, the game was about to change. They stopped on a narrow strip of dirt where fallen branches tangled like barricades. The air was warmer under the canopy, still and damp, carrying the earthy smell of soil and leaves. Morgan set her backpack down and unzipped it slowly. The sound, metal teeth parting, seemed louder than it should have been. Anissa turned her face away. Later, she would admit she couldn't bring herself to hold the knife. That task fell to Morgan. With deliberate movements, she pulled it free, a kitchen knife longer than her forearm, gleaming despite the dim light. Bella must have laughed at first, thinking it was a prank. Maybe she thought they were acting out one of their stories. But the look in Morgan's eyes wasn't playful. It was flat, focused, something far too adult for a 12-year-old face. There was hesitation, though. Morgan handed the knife to Anissa. Anissa held it for only a moment before pressing it back into Morgan's hand. Neither wanted to be the one to start, but both wanted the act to happen. That back and forth was chilling, like children playing hot potato, except that the toy was a weapon. When the first stab came, it was sudden. Bella gasped, stumbling backward. The knife struck again and again. Panic broke loose, raw and chaotic. Bella cried out, not words at first, just desperate sounds, the universal language of survival. 19 times the blade pierced, arms, legs, torso. The pattern wasn't precise, it was frantic, uneven, the violence of children who didn't know anatomy but thought they were fulfilling a duty. Bella begged them to stop. She tried to push Morgan away, tried to run, but the forest floor was uneven, the air thick, her strength faltering with every wound. And still she pleaded. She told them she trusted them. She said she wanted to live. That plea worked its way into Anissa's conscience. In her later confession, she said she told Bella to lie down so you lose blood slower. It was a strange mix of cruelty and care, as if she wanted Bella dead but couldn't stomach the speed of it. Morgan, by contrast, seemed detached. She told investigators later that she remembered feeling like a proxy, a servant of something larger than herself. She didn't speak of Bella as a friend, or even as a person, but as a task to be completed. And yet, Bella lived. Against odds, against 19 knife wounds, she pulled herself along the dirt, leaves sticking to her clothes. She crawled deeper into the woods, inch by inch, blood marking her path. Morgan and Anissa stood back watching. Then they left her there. They told her to stay quiet, to lie still, and then they walked away, believing she would soon be dead. The strangeness of it all is impossible to ignore. Children, not yet teenagers, committing an act of violence most adults can't imagine. The knife was clumsy in their hands, the plan incoherent, yet the damage was real, irreversible. Strange fact. Forensic reports later revealed that at least 2 of Bella's wounds came within a hair's breadth of her heart. A fraction of an inch made the difference between life and death. Scholarly debate. Psychologists still argue over how to categorize the crime. Was it psychosis, shared delusion, or something closer to folie à deux? A madness made possible only because 2 vulnerable minds reinforced each other. The line between childhood imagination and pathological belief had blurred until reality itself was reshaped into a motive. And so, Bella lay bleeding in the woods. The world around her continued. Birds sang, cars drove by, children played in other parts of the park. But in that secluded corner, life and death hung in the balance. And 2 12-year-old girls walked away, convinced they had pleased a faceless man who existed only in stories. The woods grew strangely quiet once they were gone. Bella lay on her side, her breath coming in short, jagged bursts. She could feel the warm damp of blood soaking through her shirt, clinging to her skin. Each attempt at a deeper breath brought stabbing pain in her chest, as though the knife wounds themselves were still lodged inside her. For a moment, she thought about closing her eyes. Maybe sleep would make it hurt less. But sleep meant death, and she was only 12. She wasn't ready to surrender. She rolled onto her stomach. The dirt pressed against her cheek, gritty, grounding. Using the last of her strength, she dug her fingers into the soil and pulled herself forward. Then again. Then again. Each movement left a smear behind her, the forest floor recording her desperate crawl. It wasn't graceful. Sometimes she collapsed flat, her breath rattling. Other times she managed a few feet before pain forced her still. But she never stopped. Something inside her refused. There's an old survival principle. The will to live can carry a body far beyond what the body should manage. Doctors later admitted Bella shouldn't have survived 19 stab wounds. And yet, inch by inch, she made her way toward the edge of the woods. She thought of her parents. She thought of her future. Maybe she thought of her so-called friends, the ones who had just left her. But mostly, she thought of getting out of the trees, out of the dark. Eventually, the light ahead grew brighter, the shimmer of an opening where the trees thinned. She pressed on. Her vision blurred, but she kept going. And then she heard it, the sound of tires crunching gravel, a bike chain rattling. A man, a passing cyclist named Greg Steinberg, noticed something unusual along the trail. At first, he thought it was an injured deer, but as he drew closer, he saw pale arms, blood, and eyes looking right at him. "Please, help me," she whispered. Her voice was faint but urgent. Greg dropped his bike and ran to her. He knelt down, horrified at the number of wounds, but careful not to let panic take over. "It's okay," he said, trying to steady his tone. "You're going to be okay. I'll get help." He called 911 immediately, his voice trembling as he described the scene. Emergency services were dispatched at once. He stayed by Bella's side, talking to her, keeping her awake, assuring her she wasn't alone anymore. Strange fact, medical examiners later found that despite 19 stab wounds, none had severed her heart or major arteries fully. 2 came within a millimeter of killing her outright, but her small frame and the chaotic nature of the attack saved her life in a paradoxical way. Scholarly debate. Trauma specialists often point to cases like Bella's when discussing the interplay between psychological resilience and physical survival. Was it biology that saved her? Her wounds missing vital organs? Or was it sheer determination that kept her crawling until someone found her? Survival psychology suggests both are true, that the human mind can push the body beyond its normal thresholds when death feels near. As the ambulance arrived, paramedics worked quickly, stabilizing her, bandaging what they could, preparing her for transport. She was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Behind them, the woods were silent once again. The knife, the plan, the attackers, they were gone. All that remained in the dirt was the winding trail Bella had carved with her own blood, a testimony that she refused to die where they had left her. She had crawled out of death's shadow. But the story was far from over. When police radios crackled that morning, the urgency was sharp. Dispatch relayed the words, 12-year-old female, multiple stab wounds, suspects believed to be same age. Even seasoned officers paused at the phrasing. Children as suspects? It didn't feel possible. Bella was already en route to the hospital, her survival hanging in the balance, but the 2 girls who had left her bleeding in the woods were not far. Reports came in of 2 young females walking along Interstate 94 just outside Waukesha. A patrol car approached, lights flashing. At first glance, they looked like any kids on a weekend morning. Hair uncombed, backpacks slung, sneakers dusty from the woods. They didn't run. They didn't even flinch when the cruiser slowed. The officer stepped out, cautious. "Hey there," he called. "Where are you headed?" Morgan answered matter-of-factly, "We're going to the mansion." Inside the backpack, police found the weapon, the kitchen knife still smeared with Bella's blood. It wasn't hidden, not really. Wrapped in cloth, but placed as though it were just another item on their journey. When asked what mansion, Anissa spoke up. She explained, almost cheerfully, that they were on their way to find Slender Man's house in Nicollet National Forest. They said they wanted to live with him, to prove their loyalty. The officers exchanged glances. It didn't feel like a game. These 2 girls weren't giggling, weren't trying to concoct a childish lie. Their tone was flat, serious, committed. They were handcuffed gently as 12-year-olds could be. Still, procedure was procedure. The ride back to the station was silent, broken only by the occasional question. Did they know Bella's condition? Did they understand what they had done? Morgan's response chilled investigators later. "Is she dead yet? I was just wondering." For police, the weight of the case began to sink in. This wasn't just an assault. It wasn't a prank gone wrong. It was an attempted murder committed by children, with a motive pulled straight from the depths of the internet's darker corners. Strange fact. When detectives later reviewed their route, they realized Morgan and Anissa had walked nearly 5 miles after the attack, with no attempt to hide. They weren't fugitives. They thought they were on a pilgrimage. Scholarly debate. The arrest reignited conversations about moral capacity in children. At what age does someone truly grasp the consequences of murder? Developmental psychologists argue that while 12-year-olds can distinguish right from wrong, the blending of imagination and delusion in this case made the question far more complicated. Were Morgan and Anissa malicious or simply too young to comprehend the permanence of death? Back at the station, the knife was tagged into evidence. Their statements would soon be recorded, their strange loyalty to a faceless man immortalized on interrogation tapes. But in that first moment, 2 girls calmly explaining they were seeking a monster's mansion, it was already clear this case would haunt Waukesha and the world for years to come. The room was small, square, and bare. A table, 2 chairs, a camera fixed high in the corner. The kind of space designed to strip away comfort, leaving nothing but truth, or at least some version of it. Anissa Wire sat with her hands folded neatly on the tabletop. She looked like a student waiting for a teacher, not a suspect in a near-fatal stabbing. Morgan Geyser sat slouched in her chair, hair messy, eyes vacant. She twirled a strand between her fingers as though she were somewhere else entirely. The detectives began gently. They were trained for hardened adults, not middle schoolers. "Can you tell us what happened today?" Anissa was quick to speak. She explained that they had to do it, that if they didn't, Slender Man would hurt their families. She described him not as a story, but as a presence. "He watches," she said. "He knows. He wanted us to prove ourselves." Morgan nodded, her face expressionless. "We had to kill Bella so we could be his proxies," she added, as though reciting a fact from a textbook. The detectives tried to steer them back to reality. "You know Slender Man isn't real, right? He's from the internet. Someone made him up." Morgan's voice sharpened. "No, he's real. We've seen him. He has tentacles." Her tone was steady, unwavering, like someone correcting a math problem. The officers exchanged glances, unsure how to proceed. Was this role-playing, or did they truly believe? Anissa leaned forward, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "We were going to live with him in the mansion. That's where we were walking." The words chilled the room. These weren't giggles or attempts to dodge responsibility. They were speaking with conviction. Then came a detail more disturbing. Morgan admitted she had thought about killing Bella for months. "I knew it had to happen," she said flatly. "I didn't want to, but I had to." She paused, then added, "I didn't feel bad." Strange fact, in the recordings, Morgan's demeanor remained unnervingly calm. At one point, she asked if Bella was still alive, not with guilt, but with curiosity, as though she were checking the score of a game. Scholarly debate. The tapes have become case studies in forensic psychology. Experts question whether Morgan's responses reflected early-onset schizophrenia, delusions that distorted reality, or whether her detachment was sociopathic coldness. The line between illness and malice blurred in every word she spoke. Anissa, meanwhile, seemed torn. She admitted she hadn't wanted to stab Bella herself. She claimed Morgan pushed her, manipulated her, but she also said she believed they had no choice. That contradiction, resistance paired with devotion, resembled something darker, shared psychosis, folie à deux, where one dominant mind infects another. By the end of the sessions, the detectives had enough. Motive, confession, weapon, all laid bare on tape. But what lingered wasn't just the facts. It was the sound of their voices. 12-year-old girls calmly describing a plan to sacrifice their friend to a faceless myth born on a message board. The camera kept rolling long after the detectives stepped out. Morgan sat humming softly, eyes drifting to the ceiling. Anissa picked at her nails, her face blank. In that sterile room, the enormity of what they had done seemed to vanish for them, leaving only the echo of a story they believed more than reality itself. By the time the sun set on May 31st, 2014, Waukesha was no longer just a quiet Wisconsin suburb. It was the epicenter of a story that spread like wildfire, gripping the nation. Headlines blared, "Girl's 12 stabbed friend in name of Slender Man." News anchors delivered the words with the same hushed tones usually reserved for acts of terrorism. And still, the phrase didn't quite make sense. Two children, driven by a character born from the internet's imagination? Parents across the country turned to their kids with urgent questions. Do you know about this Slender Man? Have you seen him online? Computers were checked, browser histories scoured. The character, once hidden in the corners of creepypasta forums, was suddenly everywhere. On CNN, on morning talk shows, in living rooms where families struggled to make sense of it. In Waukesha itself, fear spread faster than reassurance. Schools held meetings. Teachers watched closely for signs of obsession or secrecy among their students. Children whispered about Slender Man at recess, some scared, others intrigued. The line between myth and reality blurred even more in the echo chamber of childhood imagination. The media, of course, fed the frenzy. Talk shows debated whether the internet was poisoning children's minds. Newspapers ran stories tracing Slender Man's origins, created in 2009 on an online forum as part of a Photoshop contest, intended as harmless fiction. But for Morgan and Anissa, it hadn't stayed fiction. The question was everywhere. Could an online myth drive children to kill? Strange fact, Slender Man's creator, Eric Knudsen, known online as Victor Surge, issued a statement after the stabbing. He expressed deep shock, reiterating that his character was never meant for real belief, much less violence. The fiction had escaped him, becoming something he could no longer control. Scholarly debate. Sociologists seized the moment to discuss moral panic. Historically, societies have often blamed new media for youth corruption. Comic books in the 1950s, heavy metal in the 1980s, violent video games in the 1990s. Was Slender Man just the newest scapegoat? Or had the digital age created a uniquely powerful myth capable of seeding delusion in vulnerable minds? Meanwhile, Bella's name became public. Peyton Leutner. She was recovering in the hospital, her survival celebrated as nothing short of miraculous. Reporters gathered outside her family's home. The Leutners remained private, speaking only to assure the community that Bella was strong, that she would heal. But beneath that reassurance was a tremor of horror. Their daughter had been betrayed by her closest friends, left to die in the dirt. No parent could fully shield a child from that. Documentaries and think pieces soon followed, dissecting every angle. Internet safety experts warned parents to monitor their children's online activity. Psychologists appeared on morning shows, explaining the fragility of preteen cognition. Law enforcement officials fielded questions about whether the internet itself could be dangerous enough to warrant new protections. In homes across America, a quiet fear settled. If two 12-year-old girls could nearly kill their best friend over an internet story, what other stories might one day spill into reality? The case wasn't just about Waukesha anymore. It was about childhood, belief, and the blurry border between play and horror in the digital age. And the world was waiting to see. Would the justice system treat them as children, as victims of delusion, or as attempted murderers? At first, the public thought it was simple. Two girls had made a terrible choice. But as psychiatrists began their evaluations, the story grew more complicated, more unsettling. Behind the headlines lay minds that did not function the way most children's did. Morgan Geyser became the focus. From her earliest sessions, psychiatrists noticed something unusual. Her affect was flat, her gaze sometimes distant. She spoke of Slender Man not as fantasy, but as though he were an omnipresent figure, capable of punishing or rewarding her. It didn't take long before doctors suspected schizophrenia. That diagnosis is rare at 12, exceedingly rare. Yet Morgan described seeing and hearing things others couldn't. She spoke about Slender Man's orders as if they were audible commands. She also mentioned a girl named Maggie, an imaginary companion who told her to hurt people. For clinicians, these weren't the musings of an imaginative child. They were classic signs of early-onset psychosis. Anissa Weier's profile was different. She didn't appear to hallucinate. Instead, her evaluations revealed a susceptibility to suggestion, a kind of cognitive vulnerability. She admitted she had doubted Slender Man at first, but Morgan believed so strongly, so urgently, that Anissa became convinced too. In psychiatry, this dynamic has a name: shared psychotic disorder, or folie à deux. When one mind is powerful enough, another can be pulled into its orbit, reality reshaped by proximity. Listening to their taped interviews, experts remarked on the strange calm. Neither girl broke down. Neither wept for Bella. Morgan's flat voice especially stood out. When asked if she felt sorry, she replied, "I didn't feel anything. It was necessary." Strange fact, during her evaluation, Morgan once asked a psychiatrist if he could see Slender Man standing in the corner of the room. She pointed directly at an empty space and described his height, his blank face, his tentacles, as if she were reporting on an actual presence. Scholarly debate. Here, the field of law and psychiatry collided. Could a child with schizophrenia truly be held accountable for attempted murder? Was Anissa guilty if her belief was only borrowed from Morgan's delusion? Some experts argued that both were victims of mental illness, deserving treatment rather than punishment. Others insisted that delusion didn't erase intent. Bella was still stabbed 19 times, and society demanded responsibility. In private notes, one doctor described Morgan as a child adrift in her own universe. Another called Anissa a satellite orbiting someone else's madness. Yet to the courts, clinical reports were not abstract. They were evidence, ammunition for prosecutors and defense attorneys alike. Each word written by a doctor could mean years in prison or years in a psychiatric institution. As evaluations stretched on, one truth became undeniable. This was not the simple story of children imitating an internet character. It was the collision of fragile minds, myth, and untreated illness. And in the middle of it all was Bella, recovering slowly, bearing scars that told a truth no diagnosis could soften. When the case finally reached the courtroom, the real trial wasn't just about what Morgan and Anissa had done. It was about what they were. Were they children who had lost their way in a swirl of fantasy and untreated illness? Or were they cold-blooded attempted murderers who happened to be 12? Wisconsin law carried a harsh answer. By statute, children as young as 10 could be tried as adults for the most serious crimes. Prosecutors seized on that. 19 stab wounds left to die in the woods. That sounded like adult violence, they argued. The jury should see them not as schoolgirls, but as predators. The courtroom became a collision of images. On one side, Morgan and Anissa sat in oversized chairs, dwarfed by the weight of the proceedings, their hands cuffed, their faces pale. On the other side, Bella's family filled the benches, her mother clutching photos of her daughter before the attack, when her smile was still carefree and untouched. Strange fact, because Morgan was so young, her feet didn't touch the floor when she sat at the defense table. Reporters described the surreal image of a child on trial for attempted homicide, her legs swinging slightly as lawyers debated her fate. The defense pushed back with equal force. They leaned heavily on psychiatric reports, calling expert after expert to testify that Morgan suffered from schizophrenia and delusions. Anissa, they argued, had fallen into shared psychosis, folie à deux, and lacked the ability to resist Morgan's overpowering belief. They were not evil, one lawyer told the court. They were sick. There is a difference. The prosecution countered that even delusions don't erase responsibility. Morgan and Anissa had planned the attack for months. They'd chosen the sleepover as their opportunity. They'd hidden knives. They'd tricked Bella into the woods. This was premeditated, the prosecutor told the jury. Illness or not, they knew what they were doing. Here the scholarly debate widened beyond the courtroom. Criminologists and legal scholars began to argue in journals and conferences. Should children ever be tried as adults? Does society gain safety or just vengeance when it labels a child a monster? In Europe, most nations would have placed Morgan and Anissa in juvenile systems focused on rehabilitation. In America, the pendulum swung more heavily toward punishment. As arguments raged, Morgan herself seemed distant, sometimes whispering about Slender Man, sometimes smiling faintly at nothing in particular. Anissa wept more often, occasionally glancing at Bella's family with visible guilt, though her tears brought little comfort to those who had nearly lost their daughter. The trial was not only about evidence, it was a spectacle. Cameras rolled, headlines multiplied, and across the nation, parents found themselves staring at their own children differently, asking impossible questions. How much of a child's darkness is their own? And how much is planted by the world around them? By the time the gavel fell each day, the air in the courtroom was thick with contradiction. Morgan and Anissa looked like children. The crime looked like horror. And the law was struggling to decide which truth mattered more. The trial stretched on for months, but eventually the machinery of justice ground toward its conclusion. All eyes turned to the jury and the judge. Morgan's fate came first. After weeks of testimony about her schizophrenia, the jury accepted that she was suffering from a profound mental illness at the time of the attack. The verdict? Not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect. But not guilty didn't mean freedom. The judge ordered her committed to a psychiatric institution, and not for a short stay. The sentence was up to 40 years, potentially the remainder of her natural life, in a locked mental health facility. Anissa's trial unfolded differently. She wasn't schizophrenic, but her attorneys argued she had been pulled into Morgan's delusions, manipulated by fear of losing her only friend. In 2017, she accepted a plea deal, guilty to attempted second-degree homicide as a party to a crime, with the understanding that her mental illness would be considered in sentencing. The court agreed she should not go to prison, but instead spend up to 25 years in a psychiatric hospital. For Bella's family, the outcome was bittersweet. Their daughter had survived, but the scars, both physical and emotional, would remain. And her attackers, though punished, would not spend their lives behind bars. To some, it felt like mercy where there should have been severity. To others, it was proof that the system could still recognize the fragile line between sickness and malice. A strange fact from sentencing day. Morgan wore glasses and a green jumpsuit, looking less like the feared figure of headlines and more like a withdrawn teenager. Reporters noticed that as the judge read her fate, she showed little reaction, almost as if she couldn't comprehend the gravity of decades spent in confinement. The scholarly debate reached its peak here. Was justice served? Some argued that institutionalization was the humane choice. The girls would receive treatment, not rot in prison. Others insisted it was a dangerous precedent, worrying that future offenders might hide behind mental illness claims. The case became a benchmark in discussions of juvenile justice and mental health law, taught in classrooms and dissected in criminology texts. When the gavel struck for the last time, the room was silent. Bella's mother held her close, whispering reassurance. Morgan and Anissa were led away in shackles, their futures sealed not by iron bars, but by hospital walls and locked wards. The contrast was chilling. Children in handcuffs, punished not only for what they did, but for what they believed. And yet, Outside the courthouse, the legend of Slender Man continued. The case had not killed the myth. If anything, it fed it, a digital ghost made stronger by the blood it had inspired. Before we move further into the final echoes of this story, let me pause for a moment. If you've been listening this far, you're one of the few who can carry such heavy truths quietly into the night. If you'd like to help me keep sharing these unsettling journeys, tap that subscribe button and stay close, but only if you can handle the shadows. And while you're here, tell me something. What corner of the world are you in right now, and what time glows on your clock as you listen? The trial was over, but the consequences, for Bella, for the girls, for the parents, and for society at large, were only beginning to unfold. After the sentencing, the courtroom lights dimmed, but the story did not end. Bella returned home with her parents, scarred yet resilient. Her body bore the lasting reminders, 19 stab wounds, some healed into jagged lines across her torso and arms. Each scar was a map of survival, but also a reminder of betrayal. At night, she often struggled with sleep, sometimes waking in sweats, sometimes afraid of the very shadows that used to comfort her. Her recovery was not only physical. There were endless therapy sessions, both for trauma and for rebuilding trust. Imagine being 12 years old and realizing that the friends you laughed with, the ones you whispered secrets to at sleepovers, could also turn into predators. That kind of fracture isn't easily healed. Bella's family kept a low profile, but when they did speak, their message was consistent. Gratitude that their daughter survived, and frustration with a justice system that left them conflicted. They wanted healing, but healing never came as swiftly as headlines faded. Morgan and Anissa, meanwhile, began their lives in psychiatric institutions. Each was assigned to facilities designed to treat mental illness under strict confinement. Morgan's schizophrenia required heavy medication, routine evaluations, and therapy sessions that asked her to confront the delusions that had once seemed more real than daylight. Anissa, less detached from reality, faced the quiet torment of reflection. In letters she wrote years later, she described how isolation gave her no choice but to replay her decisions over and over, like a film she could not pause. One strange fact about the aftermath: in prison hospitals, juveniles often continue their education. Both girls took classes, studied math and literature, and wrote journals. In another life, they might have been high school students worrying about prom or grades. Instead, they were locked behind secure doors, watched over by guards, their adolescence measured not by birthdays, but by treatment reviews. The scholarly debate also shifted in this period. Criminologists began to point out how digital folklore, like Slender Man, had escaped the bounds of storytelling and embedded itself in real behavior. The case became a touchstone in academic conversations about internet mythology, media influence, and the psychology of belief in the digital age. Was Slender Man just an excuse or proof of how modern myths could distort vulnerable minds? Professors disagreed, and the debate continues today. For Bella, healing meant learning to trust again. She avoided interviews, choosing privacy over publicity, though her presence in court years later, when testifying about her scars, made headlines once more. She did not need to say much. Her survival was testimony enough. And in the quiet corners of Waukesha, whispers lingered. Parents spoke more cautiously about what their children consumed online. Schools added new talks about internet safety. But under the surface, there was fear. Fear that if one myth could drive children to stab their friend, what other hidden currents flowed through screens and stories, waiting to be believed. In the end, the aftermath was not a single event, but a series of ripples. Bella's slow return to life, the girl's confinement, the legal precedents, the cultural debates. They all converged into one chilling truth. Childhood had not been a shield in this story. And for Waukesha, innocence itself felt forever altered. The echoes of that May morning in 2014 never truly faded. They lingered in court records, in psychiatric files, in the scars along Bella's skin, and in the quiet watchfulness of a community that had learned how fragile trust could be. Morgan remained confined in a state mental hospital, her treatment reviewed periodically, but with no real promise of release. Doctors monitored her schizophrenia, adjusting medications, charting progress. Some years she appeared stable, articulate even. Other times, her delusions returned like fog rolling back over a landscape you thought was clear. For her, life became a cycle of therapy rooms and supervised halls, an adolescence rewritten by the illness that had once whispered Slender Man into her ear. Anissa followed her own path in confinement. Less burdened by psychosis, she faced the weight of conscience. Over time, she grew articulate about her remorse, speaking candidly in letters and evaluations about the night in the woods. "I thought I had to choose between Morgan and Bella," she admitted once, "and I made the worst choice imaginable." Her words carried pain, but also the distance of years lived inside walls meant to contain her. Bella, now older, continued to grow beyond that night. She focused on school, on family, and on the kind of quiet courage that doesn't make headlines but matters most. When she did speak publicly, it was with the clear voice of someone who had survived something incomprehensible, not as a victim defined by tragedy, but as a young woman determined to claim the rest of her life. The verdict had been delivered years before. Morgan committed for up to 40 years, Anissa for up to 25. Both technically had paths to eventual freedom through psychiatric release, but the weight of their sentences left their futures uncertain. For Bella, the punishment would always feel incomplete. For the girls' families, it was a strange mixture of relief and grief. Their daughters were alive, but behind locked doors, forever tied to a story of betrayal and blood. The scholarly debates outlived the trial. Professors, lawyers, and psychologists still reference the case when discussing juvenile crime, internet folklore, and the boundary between mental illness and responsibility. It became a textbook example in classrooms, a reminder that horror stories don't only live in books or on screens. Sometimes they step into the woods with you. As the years passed, the story of the Slender Man's stabbing settled into history, not forgotten, but folded into the long list of crimes that society struggles to understand. A case that reminded us of how myths can twist into reality, how children can be both fragile and dangerous, and how survival sometimes looks like a girl crawling through the trees, refusing to give up. And now, dear listeners, our journey with this story comes to its end. Let's let the pace soften. The sharp edges dull, the courtroom fades, the hospital walls recede, the woods grow quiet again. What remains is the knowledge that Bella lived, that resilience can outlast cruelty, and that even in the darkest stories, there can be a thread of survival. This case ends here. I wish you a peaceful night's sleep.